Good evening, Mount Olive Baptist Church, and we are so grateful that you have joined us for this final installment of this series, Managing Grief. We have been on this journey for about 4 weeks now. The first week talking really about the 5 stages of grief. Then we moved and spoke about how do men, and specifically how do Black men grieve. And last week we spoke about racial trauma and its relationship to grief. And this week, we are so grateful to be joined by none other than Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble, who will be speaking with us about how do we help others who are experiencing grief at this time, and also how can we help support children who are experiencing grief. So before I tell you all about the amazing work Dr. Alfie does, would you please join me in a word of prayer? God, thank you for your goodness and thank you for your mercy. Thank you for bringing us through this journey of grief. We pray, God, through this journey of learning about grief. We pray, God, that your spirit will be with us this evening. We pray that you would give us clarity to understand what is going on within our own selves, and also clarity to understand how we can best support others. We love you, we praise you, and we thank you. In no other name but the strong name of Jesus, who is the Christ. Amen. Amen. As I said, we are grateful to be joined by Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble. And before I turn it over to her, I would like to introduce her to you. But actually before that, I want to encourage you that if you have any questions, please put them into the chat on Facebook, on YouTube, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions to the best of our abilities. Dr. Alfie Breland-Noble is a pioneering psychologist with a passion for helping people of all backgrounds, especially youth and young adults, achieve #optimal mental health. An in-demand media expert, keynote speaker, author, and scientist, Dr. Alfie has the unique ability to translate her scientific knowledge of mental health disparities into engaging, actionable ideas for the public. She's been featured in global media, for example, CNN, NBC News 4 Washington, National Press Foundation, PBS NewsHour, NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, and amongst others, and is the founder of the innovative mental health nonprofit, the Coma Project, which I'm sure we're going to ask you at some point or another to tell us what that's all about, which has received national recognition for its effective approach to engaging marginalized youth and empowering them to care for their mental health. So Dr. Alfie, just want to say welcome to the green table. As we continue this conversation, we were so excited that you're able to join us. So as I said, for the past few weeks, we've been talking about managing grief. The first week we talked about the 5 stages of grief, then we moved to talk about Black male grief. And last week we talked about racial trauma and its relationship to grief. So but that really focused on how people were specifically experiencing it. But I think there's another side to it in understanding how do we best support others who are experiencing grief. And sometimes that could be pretty challenging.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. I appreciate always having the opportunity to be here with my church family here. This is my church home, and I appreciate the pastor, and I want to get into a whole bunch of thank yous, but I deeply want all of you to know, like my brother who's running around behind the scenes, that it takes a lot to make this work, and I appreciate you being here and allowing me to share this space with you. Definitely. And so I will start with just a quote from, this is something that I tweeted April 12th, 2021, and it was right after yet another awful shooting had happened of a Black person. And so the quote is basically this: Black grief is deep. It is far-reaching, back to the stolen bodies of the motherland, through the chains on these shores, into the daily humiliations etched into the laws of this land, and through to the heartbreak of yet another young life stolen needlessly. #we are tired. And for me, that was it just really crystallized the struggle that I was having. I think this was around the young man, Adam Toledo, when he was killed, who's not Black. I think he's Latinx, but it definitely speaks to the theme that you asked about, which is in the context of grieving, we don't always only have to focus on ourselves. Sometimes it's imperative for us to focus on the people around us, whether it is us trying to navigate their experience of us and their reaction to our grief, or vice versa. It's us trying to navigate other people's experience of grief. So I'll give you one quick personal example. My mother passed in 2006. I had just had my son. Mama wasn't here by the time I had my son, so she passed, and then 3 weeks later I had my son. And my mom was the matriarch in so many ways of her whole side of the family, and her mother had passed 3 weeks before her. So when I think about this concept, that was a rough year, and we had 2 more deaths after that. So that was a rough year. I couldn't wait for 2006 to be over. But within that, the first thing I'll share, and I have about 3 points that I want to, maybe 4, in the context of helping other people grieve. What I say to people is always start from a place of recognizing there's one God, right? And it ain't us. And so if we can remember that our job is not to fix the grief for the other person. Our job is to be the best companion or friend or loved one that we can be as that person is experiencing their grief. And the reason that's important to me, and I always start there, is because it relieves a lot of pressure from people when they hear, I don't have to fix this. So sometimes all we can do is sit with the person. Maybe you hold their hand, maybe they don't want you touching them. Maybe they just want you in the same room with them. And so I think one of the ways to, like if there were parts, that's part 1, and then subpart 1, like 1A, would be to ask people, what do they need from you in the moment? Like, it's okay to say to a person, I really don't know what to say. I don't know how to be supportive, but I'm here, and I care about you, and I want to help you. What can I do? And then to listen to what they say, that's part B. So part A is you ask, part B is you listen, part C is you do what is asked of you as long as it doesn't take you outside yourself. So another example is in Black community, whether that's Black Caribbean, Black African, African American, Black Latinx, one of the things that we like to do to support people is feed them. Right? So anytime something happens, everybody's like, now I don't know how it is in Black Caribbean culture, but in Black American Southern culture, bringing chicken and rolls, you know what I mean? Especially if there's a death. And sometimes people don't necessarily want that. They need something else. They don't necessarily want that sustenance. They want the sustenance to come in another way. So that's the first thing I would say is recognize that you're one person. Recognize that we are not God. We are not the entity sent to build and fix and create and destroy things. We are just humans who are having a human experience with someone that we love. So that's one. The second thing I will say in terms of caring for or loving someone who is experiencing grief is to understand that grief is not always solely about death. Sometimes grief is just about loss. So this could segue a little bit into when we're talking about children, and I know we'll come back to that, but I do want to mention young people in this context because when we think about young people grieving, they don't always just grieve about death. Your child or teenager or young adult might grieve about the dissolution of a relationship. That might be something powerful for them. Yeah. Your child or young adult or teen might grieve about the family having to move from the only place they've ever known, right? Somebody gets relocated for a job, that child might be grieving. Yeah. And so this idea that grief is not just about death is important because it allows us to have empathy in the moment when we might think a person's reaction to some event is outsized compared to that event, right? Yeah. When I was a kid, it was like, what you crying for? There ain't nothing to be worried about.
Yeah. I think that's important. We can just could follow up on that a little bit. Is as we are, as we think about grief, I think, as you said, a lot of people, like especially with young adults, we all have the experience of your first love, and for whatever reason, there's a small percentage of the population who end up getting married to their high schools.
Wasn't me.
Yeah, it wasn't me either, right? But there's a huge sense of loss, right? And you think, you're just 15, 16. You don't know what love is, and you probably don't know what love is, right? But there's still this experience. They are experiencing something, And sometimes they, I guess, will feel like they're not heard if you don't walk them through a grieving process. And doesn't mean you have to stay there all day with them weeping and moaning, but we have to at least acknowledge that something has happened. And I think that's hard, I think, particularly in our community to do, that to recognize loss outside of death. I think once death happens, we all get it. We're gonna bring the chicken, we're gonna bring whatever, we're gonna show up at the house, whether we want them there or not, we're gonna show up, right? And it is, but other forms of loss is a little bit more difficult.
I think it is, and I think you're absolutely right that we don't always have a language and a context for how to support someone we care for in grieving other kinds of loss. And I think the one thing I would say to that is what's vitally important is, again, to be clear with yourself about how are you experiencing that other person, and then asking that person, what do they need from you? And I know for many of us, I'm Gen X, and so for generations older than me, baby boomers and veterans, it's like children should be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
Not finna ask you what you need, but I think what it requires is for those of us who are Gen X and millennial and Gen Z, and then I heard this new thing, Gen Alpha, and I'm like, okay, it's a little
I haven't
baby.
heard that one.
I just learned it yesterday.
Gen Alpha.
Gen Alpha.
That sounds futuristic.
Doesn't it?
I'm scared of those folks.
So it's really just about making sure that we're in a place where we can be receptive to asking, listening, and then responding to what we're told. I feel like that's important. Okay, so the one other point I made two. I wanted to make one other point about this, and then I guess we can go on. And is that if we haven't healed, this is the touchy one. If we haven't healed our own grief, it is much more difficult for us to engage with other people in their process of grieving. So, for example, grieving things that may have happened to us in childhood that we've never resolved. Right? So someone experiencing, there's everything from the extremes of different types of abuse, everything from that to difficult relationships with parents, to having lost a parent at a young age and never really resolving the loss of that parent from childhood. They have a term for that. It's called complex grief. And
Spoke about that.
I was going to say, you probably did.
Yeah,
you covered
a couple
grief
times, yeah.
Much, so I'm not even going to touch it because that's not my expertise. But I think recognizing that there are experiences that we as individuals have had that frankly very much color and frame how we encounter grief, how we walk through grief, all those things you all have talked about, those stages of grief, how do you progress through those? It's not linear, it's cyclical. And some of us get stuck. But knowing that then gives us that much more opportunity and a better opportunity to be able to effectively engage our loved ones because we understand ourselves the process of what it means to cope, right? And that brings me back to this idea, this one big idea of coping skills. So the coping skills are necessary, but the coping skills are not necessarily something that everybody has. So those are the three key points I wanted to make to start.
Yeah. I want to lean in a little bit on what you said about. It just sparked, I think, questions from me. Like I've heard it said, and I'm interested to hear your response to it. I heard it said that a lot of times we're just. Some people say like we are having. We're trying to heal our inner child, or trying to deal with, or trying to reconcile our inner child. That as grown as we may be, we're still like there's a 14-year-old us, or 15-year-old us, or 16-year-old us that kind of got stuck somewhere, that we haven't moved on. And until we're able to go back to that 16-year-old moment, which is why therapy is important, folks, right? But until you're able to go back to that 16-year-old moment and deal with what happened, in that you're not able to then move on.
I agree. I agree with that 100%. It's at any stage in life, we have an event happen to us and we don't properly do two things: cope and, to the point tonight, grieve that thing that happened to us. Right? You have to grieve that loss. You have to grieve that pain. You have to grieve that experience. If we fight and resist allowing the grief process to happen, we will get stuck in it. And one of the things I always say about stress, which I also think is true about grief, is either you're going to manage that stress or that stress is going to manage you. So either you're going to manage that grief or that grief is going to manage you. And I think if we understand that, it makes it a little bit easier for us when we're trying to engage or trying to understand what to do for that loved one. If we recognize that, and I know you all talked about this before too, not everybody grieves in the same way. And so if you don't see that person crying, that doesn't mean they're not in pain. That doesn't even mean that they're resisting grief. It may just mean that they're not in a place where they feel like crying is the appropriate or comfortable way for them to express themselves in the moment. So I think it's that understanding and having context for our own way of processing grief that makes us better able to try to make room for and understand other people's way of grieving.
Yeah. So just to help the saints out there, what are the three things? I'm sure
So
recognize you're not God.
That's right. We're not God.
We're not God.
The second, oh gosh, you make this like a quiz.
Sorry.
I know hold on. I got my notes. Grief is not just about death.
Yes.
It's also about loss, because I got stuck with my subparts. And then the last one is, we were talking about the inner child, like complex grief and not getting stuck and understanding that we have to heal things ourselves before we can try to help somebody else.
We have to help ourselves. I mean, it's like the old analogy that kind of gets used as you're on a plane. They said before you put it on the next person, if the things that fall from the
That's it. Your oxygen
You know
mask.
that's what it is. Oxygen mask.
That's it.
As they fall, you put yours on first,
Yes.
and then you assist the person.
Yes.
And I think we have to think about that also with grief.
Yes.
We have to deal with our own grief before we are able and prepared to deal with other folks' grief.
Right, and think about it like this. Just even the analogy of the oxygen mask. If you pull the oxygen mask down or it falls down and you put it on wrong, you're going to put it on wrong for that other person. So you're not helping yourself and you're not helping them. But if it falls down and you put it on properly, now you got air, you can think, you're clear. Hopefully, it's just a little blip and y'all not about to crash. And then you're in a position to better be able to help that other person. But I tell you what the struggle is. The struggle is that many of us didn't have models for the people who raised us. So where are you supposed to learn how to put that oxygen mask on if nobody shows you how to do it?
Yeah, which is why I think, yes, there's different ways to grieve, but there's a beauty and a necessity for public grief.
Yes.
Also, right? That because it shows us that, number one, it normalizes grief, and it also empowers and enlightens others on how to grieve. Right?
Yes.
So I know a lot of times we try to hold it in, which is fine. Sometimes you're just not ready to process it all, right? But I think particularly as we turn to think about children, there's a benefit to grieving publicly, as long as it doesn't get out of control, but there's a benefit to grieving publicly. For our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, one of the things I did was I love statistics. So I pulled some statistics, not specific to grief, but about mental health and mental illness as it relates to Black people specifically. And I'll get to that in a second. But this idea of your point, to build on your point about public grieving, what public grieving does is exactly what you said. It normalizes it and it demonstrates that there are multiple ways to experience grief. There are multiple ways to process grief. There's not one right way and every other way is wrong. And so I think it's important for children to have those models because, like I said, if nobody shows you how to do it, how do you ever learn? That's one part, right? Now, I know we're going to come back, so I'm going to remember because it's like the quiz. The other piece of that, the related piece of that is having the conversation. So it's important for the children and young people to see these public displays of grief or, grief in public or public grieving, but it's also equally, I'll say not more important for the adults in their lives to provide context for what the kids are seeing. Think about that, because you can see stuff, but if you're a little kid, how do you use that gift of discernment to figure out, well, this is healthy and this is not healthy, right? So it's healthy to cry. It's okay to cry in public. Right? What's not healthy is to cry and then go drink and stay in that. That's not healthy, right? And it's not okay to just see that. because that's self-medicating, and then tell a child, oh, well, they just, they trying to work on the loss of that parent. That's not what we want to teach kids. And so we want to be communicating with young people in a way that is age appropriate, developmentally appropriate, and allows them to get some knowledge attached to what they're seeing. It's not enough to just put them out there and let them see. You got to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I want to spend a little bit more time as we talk about children, but to transition us to children, but let me read the text and then let's come to that, right?
Absolutely.
So the text for the night, because this is Bible study, so just in case you thought we didn't have a text for tonight, we do, right? So the text for tonight is Romans chapter 12, and it's a one-verse text, so we won't be here long. Romans 12, verse 15, and the word of the Lord reads, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. The word of God for us, the people of God, thanks be to God. Amen. It is that simple. We can memorize this. Amen. Say it with me, folks. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, right? It is pretty simple. Paul was basically at the end of this book of Romans trying to give out what are called like the marks of being a true Christian. What are some of the virtues of being a true Christian? He starts off and he's talking about, let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. All these markers. And then he comes to this one marker, which I found very powerful, is rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Meaning be present with people as they're going through the life cycles. And a couple things I want to reflect with you about is this idea of being present in one's grief, but also being present in one's joy. Because I think some would say, and it could be controversial, but you don't really know the fullness of joy until you experience some level of grief, right? Some will say that there's some beauty is the weird mystery of God. But being present in one's joys and also being present in one's grief. How does that strike you?
Yeah. What I thought you were going to say is you don't really know joy until you know how to be joyful for someone else.
That's even better. Do you know what? Scratch what I just said.
No, you're right.
Scratch all that I just said. Yes, take that. Leave out what I just said before.
I love what you said, but so I'm going to go back to what you started with, because my dad says it all the time. When I was little, I didn't get it. It used to make me angry. I'm like, oh, you're just dismissing what I'm going through. And what he said was, how do you know what the heights of joy are if you don't know what the depths of despair are? No 12-year-old wants to hear that, right? But okay. Yeah. Especially when kids are picking on him and you just like, right? And so, but those are the things that he would say. So to your point, I think that's true. That's contrast. That's the contrast I think that God gives us to allow us to experience these emotions and have these experiences fully. I need to show you what awful is so that when you have great, you can appreciate great. So first of all, I just want to honor that. I think this idea of the one thread that goes through all of this for me is this thread of being present. Yeah. You can't enjoy it if you're not present for it. You can't grieve it fully if you're not present for the grief. So what I tell people all the time, I think I was telling my daughter this earlier today or yesterday, is whatever the emotions are. Oh no, I was telling my girlfriend, because they have a family member who I'm gonna pray for them, continue to pray for them, who is really ill with COVID. They don't know what's gonna happen. And so, God heals, and so we're gonna pray for Shelvin, and I'm just gonna pray to Shelvin's gonna be okay. Yeah. But whatever you feel, allow those emotions to come up. Don't stuff them down. So she was driving, we're from Virginia Beach. She's driving home to Virginia Beach. And I said to her, if you feel like crying, pull to the side of the road. If it's so much that you can't see, find a rest stop, go to the rest stop. But be present, because what happens to us, there's a chemical thing that happens, there's a physiological thing that happens, there's an emotional stunting thing that happens each time we do not allow ourselves to feel the emotions that we're feeling. And I think that that's more powerful when it's negative emotion, but I think it's also powerful and true when there's positive emotion. If you're always suppressing joy, you don't allow yourself to experience joy, how do you ever know what it feels like? You have no sense of physically in your body what that feels like, and to our detriment, nor do you have the ability to show that to a child so that a child understands the full range of emotions. So that's what I would say to your, I think it was profound. Comment.
No, but let's now turn to what you said, because you're a lot more profound than I. As all of our guests who've come, we're just blown out the water by our guests every time. But I think what you said, that we won't. I'm going to paraphrase. You could correct me if I'm wrong on this one. But you don't experience you cannot experience the fullness of joy unless you experience the joy of others. Did I get that?
Yeah.
Oh, there it goes. Great.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm gonna write. Y'all should tweet that. And you could put Dr. Alfie's name, just throw my name somewhere in the bottom because I said it also, right? But yeah, but you can't really experience the joy of others. You can't experience the fullness of joy until you experience the joy of others.
It's empathy, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that we have to be able to. We always talk about empathy in the context of grief and sadness, but I think empathy is just being able to put yourself in another's shoes and like feel the fullness of that. Like, what does it really feel like to think about what that other person might be going through, right? So just being an empathic person means you have the ability to not only think about yourself, you have the ability to think about other people. Yeah. So for me, that piece of joy, no, you're not always going to be in a place where you experience joy for other people. No, and a lot of times jealousy is real. We gonna get jealous. It happens.
Yeah.
But I just think about, like, to me, the first thing that came to me is like being a grandparent. The joy, like, you're happy for yourself, but I think as a grandparent, you're also happy for your child who now has a child.
Yeah.
Like, that is like, I just can remember seeing my mom's face when I had my first one, when I had Morgan. She was like, I was like, I don't think I've ever seen you this happy for me for anything ever in my life. But I get it.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what's happening inside of us if we don't have the ability to experience the fullness of joy at least a few times in our life for another person? I think for part of what it means is we're not allowing ourselves to fully experience that full range of emotions.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. I think especially because we live in a society that's pretty inward, right? It's always about centering, and for good reason. You should center yourself as appropriate, right? But there's a lot of work being done now to center yourself and always put yourself first, because, and I get it, but I think it has its limits, right? We could talk about this some other time. That's the next Bible study. But, in the culture which is always asking us to center ourselves, to actually center other people is actually revolutionary. And I would say it's actually the Christian way, Paul talks a lot about, like, in Philippians, as we always skip to the part where he's been given a name that's above every other name, that name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. But before that, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And he was basically saying, don't think yourselves more highly than you ought, but always put someone else first. Just as Jesus put us before his own feelings and what he was experiencing, I think Jesus was able to experience the fullness of joy because he put us first. And I think that's a model for us as others are grieving, to kind of center them. And also, as you're probably well aware, a lot of times when people are grieving, we do this natural thing. It's like, but do you see my grief?
Yep.
It's always like, this person's grieving, and it's like, wait, hold on, but I also have a grief, and I have to tell you about my grief, and then that's just,
that makes it worse.
It makes it worse.
They feel like they're not seen, they feel like they're not being heard, and they feel like their lived experience is not being valued. So what I say to people is, particularly when you're, working with children or trying to support children just by nature, like developmentally, everything's me. So it's harder for them, let's say like 16 and under, it's much harder for them to hear us try to describe for them what our grief or what our similar experience is. Yeah. So what I tell people is this, is just to your point, it's a natural tendency. So when you're working with a child or talking with a child or supporting a child, I think what you say is something like, I'm going to tell you this story, not because I want to take away from what you're going through, but I want you to see that you are not alone. And then you tell them a little bit of your story rather than just diving into, yeah, because when I was 12, such and such, so-and-so happened to me. That kid does not care, right? And plus, they're like, that was in the olden days. Did y'all even have color TVs back then? Do you know what I mean? So, did y'all have cell phones or whatnot? And so I think that's important. But you're right, it's a natural tendency. And that, again, is why it is so important that we process and manage and deal with and work through our own grief, because the thing that we don't want to do, even if it's inadvertent, is to pass along bad messages for poor coping mechanisms to our young people. We want to pass along the best coping mechanisms possible, and we can only do that if we have healthy coping mechanisms.
So what are some of these coping mechanisms, particularly for youth? Like, so say, I think we covered, to take youth grief seriously,
Yes.
right? I think we mentioned it,
Yes.
and we probably want to lean in on about that. Like, we need to take what our youth and young people, that they could be 6 years old. I mean,
Yes.
I'm sure my 16-month-old, he's going to grieve the moment that we take away. I mean, he grieves anytime we take away a toy from him, right? And we try to say, well, we try, and because he's a baby, we talk
That's good.
we talk it through with him.
Yeah.
But we want to tell people that youth grief is real, and it may seem the loss of friends. I mean, when you lose a friend in junior high school or high school from moving away or they having a falling out, can be traumatic.
Yes.
And I think it deserves that kind of language.
Yes, I agree. And then the other thing is when we think about the rates of suicidality, right? So we have young people who are dying by suicide. When we think about other things that are taking our young people physically away from us, and when we think about things like how many kids are just in a poor, bad headspace, and so they really can't be present for their friends, that's even a loss for some of our young people when they start withdrawing and pulling away. And so I think the idea is that, again, to your point, we want to be able to engage in conversation with young people from a stance of I feel like this is the number one coping skill, active listening. Which I feel like both of us have been practicing tonight. So active listening consists of, and I know you know all this, giving your spouse, but active listening consists of looking at the person. You don't have to stare at them, but you have to make eye contact somewhat. Paraphrasing or rephrasing what you've heard, summarizing, asking questions without being intrusive, and without sounding like a parrot. So, did you say such and such and so and so? And like every time they say something, no, that's not quite it. But summarizing and paraphrasing, and then just checking in, right? So saying to them, and I do this all the time. I think, for the most part, my family members are okay with it, and they probably get annoyed with it. But I think it helps me process, because they're talking, especially my kids, they're saying so much. I'm like, okay, I got lost around point 2. Yeah. So let me go back and say, okay, what I heard was this. Do I have that right? Yeah. And I think when you do that, I don't mind when people do that to me, because I know you're listening, and I know you're trying to process. And for some of our young people, we may be the only person in their life, whether we're their mentor, their sponsor, their big brother, big sister, who's doing that for them. And that's important, because they need to not only feel that, but they need to learn that skill of active listening for their relationships.
Yeah. And before we go a little further, as you're talking about active listening, what's a resource that people can learn? Because it is something that you have to practice, especially when things get tense, right? Because that's when it's most needed. Because when things are calm and it's just really a one-sided thing, then active listening, you kind of fall into it pretty easily. But when things are tense,
that's hard.
It becomes very difficult. So where can folks find out more about active listening, or is there any resources out there for them in this?
There's a couple things. So one that's super easy that they can always go back to is this is the first one that came to mind, so forgive me. I have a YouTube channel, Dr. Alfie Breland Noble, and I literally have a 2.5-minute post on the YouTube channel that says active listening, that describes it and tells people how to do it.
Great.
It's plenty of people who have that. So you go to mine, or you just get in YouTube and look it up and look for somebody reputable right? Just not just any random person. That's one.
Don't look for active listening with Daryl Laban. You probably don't want that one.
Then the other thing I would say is Google can be your friend. So I tell people we want to use Professor Google to research stuff, not Dr. Google to diagnose stuff, right? So you want Professor Google who's going to go teach you stuff.
Yeah.
And so you want to go places like the website of the American Psychological Association or the website of the American Psychiatric Association or Marriage and Family Therapy. Like, think about all those degrees, the alphabet soup, and look up those organizations. And then the final thing and just put in active listening.
Yeah.
And then the final thing is there are apps. There are literally apps out there. Now, don't ask me to name any off the top of my head. I know a new one, but it's in beta testing, and I don't think I'm supposed to talk about it yet. But there are, I know they're not the first people to come up with it. There are other apps out there that will literally give you some skills that you can practice. There are cognitive behavioral therapy apps. There are active listening apps. So find the app and just something free, you don't pay for it, and just practice.
Yeah. So active listening, you said that's number one. Are there other ways to help support young people who are grieving?
Yes. So in addition to that active listening, going back to some of this a little redundant, we want to teach young people coping skills, right? But we got to have coping skills.
Yeah.
And so, there are all kinds of resources to help you cope. Active coping, like you Google it, you find all kinds of stuff. I think what's also really important piggybacks off of what we learned the last Bible study, which is about race and racial trauma.
Yeah.
That there are unique aspects of coping that are specific to that racial trauma, right? And those include things like stuff that Black people automatically do, I think, racial socialization. You have to talk to your child about what it means to be a Black human being. If your child's not Black, whatever they're, as a person of color, what it means to be that type of person in our society. That's a coping skill, right?
Yeah.
Everything from what to do when the police stop you to how to conduct yourself in the store. I'm not saying beat them over the head, don't touch nothing, you ain't getting, I'm not saying that, but I am saying.
Going in this store, don't even ask me for nothing.
That's it. We all heard it, right? We all heard, keep your eyes on me, don't be looking around, don't be going down to the sugar cereal aisle because you ain't getting none, right? None of that. I'm just like, give them a set of sort of house rules. Right? So every family should have some house rules. This is how we do things in our house. You know how they used to have like the shield, the coat, the shield, the family shield? Where you had like that little, like a banner or a shield or something that had symbols that reflected your family. Families want something like that reflect this is what we do in our household and this is how we act. So those are a couple things. And then I think that another big one for me is teaching young people and practicing ourselves self-awareness. Because you can have the tools, but all tools are not going to work for all people. So if you don't have at least some modicum or modest level of self-awareness, you'll be trying things and won't stick with them because they're not a good fit for you. And then one other one that I love along those lines, like a coping mechanism, even for grief. I tell my kids all the time, I'm always preaching about meditation. And if meditation is not your thing, make it prayer. Silent prayer, right? Teach your children how to pray silently. Teach them how to be in a quiet space. Teach them how to just stop, just for a minute or two. And then the last one that I really love, which I think is also useful, is deep breathing. So those are some of the tools I would say we want to share with young people.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Of course, I have bias toward like prayer, but meditation and those things. I think actually in many school departments, they're actually incorporating mindfulness, I think is the term that they use for it, into the curriculum because it just has such great outcomes, especially for what all of our kids are experiencing. I guess the question is, how does, we talked about this last week as related to racial trauma, and we didn't prep for this, so sorry.
That's okay.
But how, I was just with my cousins who are like 10, 17 and like 19. Just last week. And just their awareness of what is going on in the world in terms of like the George Floyd. I mean, everyone was locked down, right? But they were we went to the African American Museum and the Smithsonian, which I encourage everyone to go to. We've been like 5 times. So we're like, you're coming to DC, you're gonna see this. But there's just awareness of all that's going on. And I kind of wanna say like, and maybe I'm being a little nostalgic, I had a little bit more innocence
Yes.
about what was
A
going
lot
on in the
more.
world.
Yes.
And that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. I don't know, I'm not making a value statement on it. But how do we help, our kids are even more exposed
Yes.
to things.
Yes.
My son, when he's 15, he's gonna be more exposed than
Yes.
I ever was at 15 years old
Yes.
because of technology and
Yes.
social media and all that. How do we help kids who are just, I think, overexposed
Yes.
to some extent?
Yes. So I'm so happy you brought that up. And what I say to parents all the time is, in an ideal world, a child under the age of 13, I said ideal, would not have social media. But that's ridiculous because I know they have it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know they do.
Yeah.
And so given that our young people have access to social media, they have access to the internet all the time, right there in their hand, one of the best things we can do, again, is have conversations and set expectations, right? So setting expectations is key because, again, going back to that code of arms that each family should have, if you have not told your child what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, like my spouse says all the time, either you're going to teach them or the street's going to teach them.
Yeah.
Right? And so you want to be the one to put that knowledge in their head. You don't want just any random person out there teaching your children. So managing their social media, like setting limits and setting expectations. Monitoring, right? I'm not saying cyber stalk your kids, but I am saying make sure that they're aware that at any given time, you might roll up on them, right?
Yeah.
On Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook. I still haven't figured out Snapchat, but so if
You have 24 hours to roll up on them
okay.
on Snapchat.
Right,
by
I
the way.
know. I got to get to it. I got to get with it. But it's important that we make an effort to make sure that we're communicating to our children that it's not the unfettered wild, wild west out there that I'm going to allow you to just go be in it, right?
Yeah.
So we have expectations. I'm going to monitor, and you should be aware that at any time I could pop up on you. And then the final thing I think is, again, it comes back to this idea of how often are we checking in with our children? Are we having conversations? So two tricks I'll teach that I always share with parents, I think this can be good for grief as well, is a weather report with your child. I don't care how old they are. And the weather report is exactly what you might assume. If you're having a great day, it's sunny. If you're having a meh day, it's partly cloudy. If you're having an awful day, it's thunderstorms. Just 2 or 3 minute conversation with your child, tell me how you're doing. That is definitely applicable to grief. And then the final thing is, don't ever, ever, ever anymore ask your child, how was your day? Or just, how are you doing? Don't ask that anymore. And if you do ask it, because you forget, say it, and then right behind it, say something like, tell me something good that happened to you today. Tell me something that you didn't enjoy or that you didn't like or that was bad that happened to you today, because they can't say yes or no to that question.
That is really smart. And I think that's good for adults as well. I mean, I think a lot of times we say, culturally, we just say, hey, how are you doing?
Right.
And the only answer is, I'm fine, right? Like, no one wants to know anything more. And
Right.
it's just but I think to say that for kids, to say, how are you doing? And tell me,
Yes.
you know,
Explain something to me.
Explain something.
Yes.
How was that exam today?
Yes.
How do you think you did on it?
Yes.
Or what have you? Or how's whatever your friend's name?
Yes. Just like you did when we came in, right?
Yeah.
How's my family? Like, how are you all coping?
Yeah.
I can't just say like fine to that, because then I feel like, well, what kind of bad person just like somebody's showing empathy by asking you? You
Yeah.
don't just respond to that with one word.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And how do we help, and this is one of the final questions.
Okay.
How do we help kids to push it a little further
Yes.
versus the everyday, like with all the, as I said, like the overexposure to
Yes.
like the death of George Floyd,
Yes.
right? Or like last week as we were talking, I said like I could only watch it one time personally,
That's it.
right?
That's
But
it.
like it's like all over social media. Like I said I was only going to watch it one time,
Yeah.
but I probably watched it many more times, just seeing clips.
Yes.
And the many clips of
Yes.
things, just we're being bombarded with it. Also, COVID. There was nothing else to do but watch the news.
Yes.
So how do we help kids through that? And my one other question is,
Yes.
how do we help kids through the grief of COVID
Yeah.
and the loss of relationships?
Yeah.
And especially those kids who are transitioning to new schools and starting it on Zoom.
Yes.
This is the time. They're about to start back school.
Yeah.
How do we help in those 3 ways? Sorry, I gave you like
No, you're
3
fine.
things.
You're fine. So I can start with the last one first because that's salient for me because my kids are getting ready to go back to school. And I think coming back to, it's going to be a little bit redundant, but coming back to the only thing I can manage is in the moment effectively. I don't know what's coming.
Yeah.
I'm not in control of what's coming. What's behind me is already past, right? And along with that, I've happened to be a quite anxious person. And what I say to people is, that's what feeds anxiety. Remembering, trying to fix what was already packed, you can't change it, or worrying about what's coming. And I think the same thing is true for children. So the best thing I think that we can do around this idea of transitioning back to school, like I said, starting there, and changes in relationships, and you haven't seen your friends, and now you're gonna see them all the time, or maybe vice versa, is to keep coming back to being present. So if you can be present yourself, and you can keep reminding your child to be present. So when your child starts off on that tangent, like one of mine, about, oh my gosh, college applications, and let's be here today.
Yeah.
You've done enough to work on that already. Let's just be here right now. And I can even see my children, right? And so we have to do that. But we got to practice it as adults before we try to admonish our children and get them to do it. So that's that piece. And then the other question, I think I forgot it.
George Floyd.
Yes,
and the racial trauma and the
Yes.
overexposure. Yeah.
So one is, your point was you saw it once, right? And then you couldn't actively went and looked at it. But then there were all these other times where it kept popping up. I've never seen it. And because I know me, because I'm just anxious and it would never leave my brain. It would just, you know what I mean? It would just be burned in there and I don't think I could take it. So anyway, what I say to parents is you have to limit and curate the news that you expose children to. You have to. The average kid, I'm gonna tell you, yes, they're overexposed, but they're not running around searching for these kinds of videos. They're not looking for that. Now, it may be in their feed, but they're not going and searching for it, right? And so I think what we do is we have constant conversations with our young people to reinforce and reiterate that you wanna limit and curate how much of that news. So limit is just setting how much time you're going to allow them to spend on it. Curate is what types are you going to let them see. The best way I would say for teenagers, for parents to help teenagers manage that, is to use stuff like Now This, right? They do little clips, 60-second doc, things that they're already going to see on social media and be exposed to anyway, but that do the news in brief clips. They used to have one for NBC. I forget what it's called. It's a young brother who does it. And literally it's a 3-minute show on Snapchat through NBC where they give you all the highlights in 3 minutes. 3 minutes is not enough time for you to see any wild, wild stuff. So those are the things I would limit and curate. And then I think just constant checking in with your young people and monitoring what they're doing in terms of what they're exposed to. Those are things that we must do.
Great. Before we end, can you tell us what the Acoma Project is?
Oh yeah, thank you for giving me the opening, yay. Okay, so the Acoma Project is, long story short, in 1999 I went to the American Psychological Association convention in San Francisco. And Dr. David Satcher, I'm like such a fan, gave a big report about, and now he's not even a psychiatrist, but I know he's an MD, but he's not a psychiatrist. He gave a report on mental health. And as part of that report, he talked about the mental health of people of color. It's a huge report. Seminal work in my field. And from that, I decided that we had to have a way to get Black people specifically into treatment, because hearing you say go to therapy is a good thing, that's definitely not something that I heard in my generation and older, right? So my thing became, we need something to teach people and share with people that it's okay to go get mental health support. So Acoma Project started out African American knowledge optimized for mindfully healthy adolescents, and now it's just Acoma. We used to be a research lab, because I'm a researcher. In 2017, we became a 501c3 nonprofit, and now we're on the web, acomaproject.org, and we have 3 things. It's the final thing I'll say. Our 3 pillars are raising consciousness around the mental health for all people of color and marginalized young people, LGBTQ and disabled young people, immigrant young people, all young people. Empowering people with tools. We want young people to know how to take care of themselves if they never go to therapy. And changing the system so that people feel comfortable being able to go find and access available mental health care. And that's Acoma.
Great, thank you. And if people, how can they find Acoma Project?
acomaproject.org. And let me say this, we're giving, for people between the ages of 12 and 30, we currently have a well-funded program through our partnership with Harry's Shave Club, the shaving people. They gave us a bunch of money, God bless them, to give free therapy to between 12 and 30 years old for young people.
12 and 30, you hear that, Saints? If you're between the ages of 12 and 30, you can get free therapy through the Coma Project. So if you know any of your young people, and this is the truth, if you're not able to help manage the grief with your young one or your young adult,
That's right? That's right.
Hey, here goes a resource. We've been talking about it. That is really, 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 really helpful,
Praise God.
particularly for our community. And for those who are over 30, we got to go to therapy.
Yes.
We hope that this series has been a blessing to all of you. We have went, as I said, first we really spent some time thinking with Dr. Tracy Price about the 5 stages of grief. Then we spoke with Dr. Kermit Crawford as he told us and helped preach to us about Black men and grief and how we grieve differently from others. We also spent some time last week with Dr. Siobhan Moore-Laban, she happens to be my spouse, as we spoke about racial trauma. And this week, right now, we just finished this amazing time with Dr. Alfie Brilliant-Noble as she shared her heart and her wisdom and her knowledge on how we help young people through their grief, and also dropped a free resource for therapy. And I was closing down, but we have a question, and I want to make sure we get to this question before we go, and then we'll head out. Sure. So Sister Renee is asking, how do you help your teen navigate information received from peers who are on social media, and your teen feels that they are missing out by not having that app?
That's a hard one. I don't know that there's an easy answer for that. It's a wonderful question, and I think the question becomes, it's a cost-benefit analysis. How much is it going to cost a family, not in terms of money, but just in terms of what your values are in the household? How much is it going to cost you to keep that child off that app and still sort of that child grieving the loss of I can't do what my friends are doing, versus letting them be on the app and managing that for them? So I think that's the question. And once you make a decision about that question, that gives you guidance. So if your decision is no way, no how, because I don't like none of that mess I'm seeing over there that don't fit in my household, then you're going to have to continue to have conversations with your child about why you've made that decision so they always understand. But the worst thing we can do is say no, like this is how our generation was raised. Say no, and don't ask me no more.
Because I said so.
Exactly.
That's it.
Don't do that to kids, because that doesn't help them process and learn and develop an understanding for why you're making the decisions you're making as a parent. And you want them to understand it's not okay to just say because I said so. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. So talk to your child.
Thank you. So, thank you again, Dr. Alfie, for joining us. People in the chat, throw out some likes and some hearts, and thank her for joining us this evening. Check out her website, Coma Project. If you know someone who needs these resources, folks are asking, where can we get it? There it goes. And thank Harry Shave Club. Yes. I have used some of their products. Yeah. I want an endorsement too. But thank you again for joining us. We have a couple of announcements that we'll love to share with you in the life of the Mount Olive Baptist Church. The second installment of the Family Bible Hour will drop on Monday, August 16th. So get your family together, snuggle up on the couch, and tune into a Family Bible Hour, God's Literature. We will read a new amazing book together, When God Made the World. Learn a lesson and also put it into action. Also, there's a way for you to win free stuff. So the Bible Hour will be dropped on our social media platforms and on our website on Monday, August 16th. So next week, find some time. It will be great. Also, our Olive Cart Ministry, in partnership with the Capital Area Food Bank, will hold our monthly drive-through food giveaway on Saturday, August 21st. We will begin at 10 a.m. 200 boxes will be available, which are filled with fresh vegetables and 1 protein. This event is a first come, first served. One box will be provided for each vehicle. A special walk-up location will also be available for those who are not driving. To ensure social distancing, members of the public are asked to remain in their vehicles. Also, all people in all times have faced giants, so that's why we have this sermon series, a battle plan for fighting giants. But no matter what the giants we face, the story of the shepherd boy David gives us instructions on confronting and defeating the obstacles in our lives. Join us this Sunday as Pastor Victor continues exploring the lessons found in 1 Samuel 17 as a battle plan for fighting giants. Worship is available on all social media platforms at 9:30 a.m. each Sunday. Men of all ages are invited to attend Mount Olive's men's conference entitled The Olympic Year, Strengthening Our Spiritual Muscles. Meet us on Zoom for an interactive session on as we learn how to become champions and overcome the myriad of challenges that men of color face every day. The conference will take place on Saturday, September 11th at 10 a.m. Our very own Deacon Nolan Bivens will be our presenter. Please visit the church website today to register. And as a side, we want to just remind folks to please get vaccinated. This is, as you know, you've been watching the news. The Delta variant is real. Now we're up to Lambda variant. And the statistics are clear that your vaccination does help reduce hospitalizations and death drastically. So we want to encourage everyone to get vaccinated as soon as possible. If you need help finding a vaccination clinic, you call us at the church, go to your local pharmacy. Literally, go to your Rite Aid, CVS, Walgreens, wherever, and just walk in. They're giving out vaccines. Your local health department also has resources, but we just really want to say that as well. So thank you again for joining us for this last installment of this Bible study. Be on the lookout next week, and we look forward to seeing you on Sunday as we continue this sermon series, A Battle Plan for Giants. Thank you again. God bless you. See you later. Awesome.